Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX with me, Devika Devan. In what could mark a major diplomatic breakthrough, US President Donald Trump has announced that he will be arranging face-to-face talks between Russian and Ukrainian presidents to help end the war. Trump has added that Putin and Zelenskyy talks would be followed by a trilateral summit involving the three nations. Vice President JD Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff are coordinating with Moscow and Kyiv for the same. But what really are Ukraine's priorities at this point in time? From what we understand, the first priority is a complete halt of all hostilities, including Russian military strikes, starting with a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. The second priority is complete withdrawal of Russian forces from occupied Ukrainian territories, including those in 2014. The third priority is ironclad security guarantees involving US, NATO, European allies to prevent future aggression. And number four is accountability for Russian leaders responsible for the war, recognition of atrocities during conflict. Speaking of which, Russian President Vladimir Putin and his priorities seem to be the following. The first one being withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Donbas region, giving Russia control of this territory. Number two is recognition of Russia's sovereignty over Crimea. The third is securing official status of Russian language in Ukraine. And the fourth is, while Putin has expressed willingness to consider NATO-style security guarantees for Ukraine, he remains adamant that his opposition to Ukraine's membership to NATO be respected. What will it take, however, to broker a peace deal? We take this conversation forward. I have with me on the broadcast Julia Kazdobina, Senior Fellow, Ukrainian Prism, joining us from Kyiv. Ms. Kazdobina, thank you so much for speaking with NewsX. I want to begin by understanding from you, we've just learned a few minutes ago that Donald Trump has spoken about the possibility of UK and German troops being present in Ukraine, and that in his perspective, having those boots on the ground should not be a problem. How do you view these developments? Do you think that that's something Russia would possibly agree to?
Well, that's something that Russia most likely is not going to like, and we have already heard some statements from the Russian MFA spokesperson. I don't remember her name, but she said that any presence of foreign troops on the Ukrainian territory is going to be an escalation that could lead to the Third World War III. Of course, she doesn't mention the presence of the Russian troops on the Ukrainian territory, which are also foreign troops. But for Ukraine, it's essential that we do have security guarantees, and that those are provided by our fellow European nations, because Russian war in Ukraine is not only a challenge to Ukraine, it's also a challenge to the entire European security order. And we believe that we have to deter Russian aggression jointly. And so Ukraine will only welcome if other countries send their troops to Ukraine to serve as they say, as a reassurance force. And that's something that's being discussed within the context of the coalition of the willing. And so to make sure that Russian aggression doesn't happen again after any sort of a deal is made.
Ms. Kazdobina, what exactly, in your perspective, would that mean when we talk about security guarantees? Membership of the NATO, Donald Trump has briefly said, is possibly not going to happen. And it's in the same context that he's spoken about several European nations possibly having military presence in Ukraine. But if that's something that Russia would not agree to, in your perspective, where does that really leave the peace talks?
Well, Russia is very ambiguous on these security guarantees. So coming out of the conversation between Mr. Witkoff and President Putin earlier, Mr. Witkoff came out of that and said that Russia has agreed to security guarantees to Ukraine. And actually, At the end of the Alaska talks, at the press conference, President Putin also mentioned that Ukraine will need security guarantees. But he never really mentioned what those will be. And so Ukraine, as the party who is the most interested in this, first and foremost, Ukraine has accepted the position of the United States that Ukraine is not going to become a NATO member, although it still believes that this is the best security guarantee there is. But President Trump said, no, this is not going to happen. And so Ukraine is now working on building an alternative security framework. And President Zelenskyy, in today's press conference, said that it brings together a group of about 30 nations, and they are different nations. Some of them are European, some of them are NATO members, some of them are not, like Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, and who are willing to help Ukraine and to serve as Ukraine's security guarantors, but they will provide assistance in accordance with their abilities. So, for example, some nations are not allowed to send their troops to other countries by their constitution, so they can maybe provide some financial support. Like some other countries could be better in maritime capabilities, so they could help protect a coastline and things like that.
Ms. Kastabina, I also want to understand from you, when we talk about no NATO membership anymore, there was a perception across the world that the war began in the first place because of this lingering aspect of the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. However, Donald Trump is now very clear that that's going to be a major issue as far as the peace deal is concerned, and he's not willing to offer it. Is there any sense of betrayal amongst the people of Ukraine when you hear the sort of statements or the sort of peace deals that are being made on your behalf?
Well, so far there have not been any public opinion polling regarding this change. I mean, Ukraine is still working with NATO to enhance its capabilities and to build up its military in accordance with Western standards. But we were told explicitly that we're not going to become a NATO member. But I think it's also an important point, because despite this very clear statement from Donald Trump that Ukraine is not becoming a NATO member, Russia still insists on continuing its aggression. Russia still refuses to agree to a ceasefire. And to me, it indicates clearly that Russia is not a victim that it's trying to portray itself. It is an aggressor. It does commit this aggression willingly, and it's going to be difficult to resolve this. But Ukraine needs security guarantees, and I think if those are efficient, Ukrainian people will accept them, even if that's outside of NATO.
And will there be disappointment if Ukraine does have to, or rather, what would be the extent of disappointment if Ukraine has to accept giving up parts of its land to Russia as part of the peace deal?
Well, Ukraine will not agree to cede the land legally, so we may accept that we cannot reconquer it at this point militarily. But we will not agree to give that up legally and recognize Russian sovereignty over that land. And also, Ukraine will not withdraw from the parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts, which Russia has failed to occupy. Because Russia claims that it's this really strong power, but if you look at how much it managed to capture since the beginning of this full-scale aggression, and if you detract the land that it captured in the early stages of the conflict, meaning 2014, 2015, then it's a very small section. So it's absolutely clear that Russia is not capable of capturing those territories, and so she's trying to bully Ukraine into accepting its totally unacceptable conditions, and Ukraine will not be bullied. Russia is not as strong as it would like to seem. So there's gonna be no disappointment. Ukraine is not surrendering that.
Okay, all right, Ms. Kazdabina, thank you so much for joining us and giving the Indian audience a perspective from Kyiv. I want to swiftly move on to Mr. Andrei Lucidi, a war reporter joining us from Moscow. Mr. Lucidi, I want to understand from your perspective, as far as the peace deal is concerned, what really is going to be the make or break for Vladimir Putin?
Well, here the new development of the situation are read in a very positive perspective. The last talks in Alaska between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump are considering a big victory for Vladimir Putin as a president and generally for the Russian diplomacy system. And the position of the U.S. president is like a surprise for the Russian society, because he seems to be very cooperative for find a solution in this conflict and for be a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, a role that maybe the European Union choose to avoid. And the perspective is that the Russian government can have what asked. I mean, the sovereignty of the territory that have claimed in the past years, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson Oblast. Of course, for Zaporozhye and Kherson and maybe Donetsk, not totally, but we need to know that I'm located in Lugansk right now, and here the Russian troops have the control of 99% of the territory of the Lugansk region. And maybe the West will not allow to recognize officially the Russian sovereignty of the new Russian regions, but in the fact, like was for Crimea, in the fact the sovereignty will be of the Russian Federation.
But Mr. Lucidi, what makes the Russian Mr. Putin think that Ukraine will accept these conditions? And if these conditions are not accepted, are we looking at the war continuing on?
Well, on the field, the military operation from the Russian side is proceed. That means that if Ukraine will not accept such condition, the war will continue without any doubt. And in base of the last news from Washington and the last declaration of Donald Trump, it seems that Volodymyr Zelenskyy is on the way to accept some losing of territory for Ukraine. Yesterday, after the meeting between Zelenskyy and the European leaders, Donald Trump said that now Zelenskyy is beginning to accept some loss of territory. And this is completely new for our perspective, because in the past months, Volodymyr Zelenskyy refused any kind of concession to the Russian Federation. But now, maybe Donald Trump discussed with him, and he will agree some concession in the change of peace. I think that this is completely new perspective from the Ukrainian side. And the question that I will ask to myself is how can the reaction from the Ukrainian policy to this new position of Zelenskyy?
Okay, all right. On that note, I want to thank both of our guests for joining us on the broadcast to give us those perspectives from Kyiv and Moscow. But I'm also being joined at this point in time by Mr. John Foreman, CBE. Mr. Foreman, thank you so much for joining us on UK. Mr. John Foreman is the former UK Defence Attaché to Moscow and Kyiv. Mr. Foreman, I want to begin by asking you, how do you view the recent meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin?
Well, I thought the spectacle of watching the American president hosting an indicted war criminal in Alaska was, as our previous Prime Minister said, Boris Johnson, nauseating. And I thought what was really clear was that it didn't actually deliver that much. So, I think Trump had lots of high expectations, the meeting on Friday, but actually we saw from the curtailed meeting, the cancelled lunch, the lack of question and answers, that not substantial progress was made. There was no progress on a ceasefire. There was no progress on a framework for a deal. There was no real move forward, I think. And it just struck me as all quite hasty, that the preparation had been inadequate to really mean that the meeting could come off strongly. So I think people said that actually Trump looked low energy at the end.
Yes.
And we had no commitment from Vladimir Putin for peace. So I thought it was a bit of a bust, to be honest.
Okay, so if I have that clear, do you think or do you not think Donald Trump will be successful in bringing the Russia-Ukraine war to an end?
Well, I mean, firstly, I'd give credit to Donald Trump for investing a lot of time and effort in his presidency. I mean, I think the war matters more to Russia than it does to the United States. And I think that Donald Trump sees Russia as a declining power. He sees Ukraine as a European problem. He sees it through a European lens. And he has put a great deal of effort in it. He's met Putin, he's hosted leaders yesterday, he's sent his envoy there, he's spoken to Putin loads of times. We've had meetings between the Russians and the Americans in Saudi Arabia. But I think landing a peace deal is going to be extremely difficult because Russia under Vladimir Putin has shown no sign of compromise for the last 3.5 years. And Putin's demands are very similar to they were last year. And what he really wants is Ukrainian capitulation. And he wants a reset of the European security architecture. And on the other side, Ukraine is fighting for its independence, its sovereignty, and its own territory, and doesn't want to give way to Ukraine, to Russia, to allow force to triumph. So, though I salute the efforts of the American president, I think the path is still very narrow and very twisty towards a final peace deal.
Okay, Mr. Foreman, in the past, you've also argued that Russia's high casualties will not force them to the negotiating table. Why do you believe that human cost is so inconsequential?
Well, I mean, I wrote an article for The Spectator over the weekend, and I was looking at, there's this feeling in the West, in particular, that once casualties went past 1 million, killed and wounded, that would change Russia's course. And I think, firstly, Russia and the Kremlin doesn't particularly care about the human toll. It's indifferent to suffering, both of its own people and the suffering of the Ukrainians. I think the Kremlin thinks it's still got enough people coming in. It's recruiting enough people, which outweighs the casualties. It's spending a lot of money enticing new recruits in. So there's this enticement of volunteers to keep fighting. There's no public pressure. And also, of course, being Russia, they use the whip on the heads of the population to instill a climate of fear. Now, I do think there are measures that America and others could take on Russia, but especially on economics. But I don't think that hoping for a change of course because of casualties is realistic, and I think it's something we should set aside. And there's absolutely no sign of any anti-war movement whatsoever in Russia, which will provide pressure on the Kremlin.
Okay, interesting. At the same time, Mr. Foreman, Ukraine has said that Russia's refusal to agree to a ceasefire is complicating efforts to end the war. How do you view this?
Well, I think Russia's never wished to have a ceasefire because Russia thinks and Putin thinks he's winning. And what the Putin calculation is that if we have a ceasefire in place, that's it. The line will be frozen, Ukraine will be partitioned, which I don't need to tell an Indian audience about the problems of that. And Putin's ambition to at least occupy all 4 annexed territories in Ukraine would be impossible, especially if it's backed up by a hard security force. So Russia's never wanted a ceasefire. And I think what happened over the weekend after the summit in Alaska was that Trump changed his position abandoned his own precondition for a ceasefire and now moved across to the Russian position. So now we have all the issues on the table. We have land, we have Ukrainian status, Ukrainian foreign policy in NATO and the European Union, domestic policy, quote, besides the army. You have European security, and you have the US-Russia relationship on, all together, all to be discussed in some massive peace deal. And again, I think that's why I think it's going to be complicated to land all that, because it's so many moving parts within that potential deal, any one of which could derail the whole process.
Okay, Mr. Foreman, I also have to ask you, there's been some talk about Ukraine giving up parts of its land. So what precedent do you think will be set if Donald Trump is successful in mediating the Russia-Ukraine war by convincing Ukraine to give up parts of its land?
Well, I mean, I think first we should say that I think there will be a land for peace deal. And I thought the same for a year. And I've been on the record to say that Russia cannot conquer the whole of Ukraine, and Ukraine cannot kick the Russians out to the 2022 borders or 2014 borders. So unfortunately, there will be a messy, unsatisfactory compromise by both sides. That is the most likely scenario. But I think in compelling Ukraine to capitulate even more land, which Russia never occupied, would be very morally difficult. We've had a whole principle since 1945 that borders should stay where they are, that borders should not be changed by force, and that sovereign nations have the right to territorial integrity and independence. And the fact that if Trump acquiesced to Putin's demands to hand over 30% of Donbass, where 1 million Ukrainians live, that would send a precedent around the world. Every country would be fearful of its borders because the American president rolled over, allowed Russia to gain more land without force. So I think it's a very primitive principle that might is right. It's something that the British went to war with twice in the 20th century, and there are many wannabe dictators around the world who are looking on what is going on in Ukraine and trying to work out what's going on.
Okay, Mr. Foreman, and that brings me to my next question. What do you think will be the future of Volodymyr Zelenskyy as the leader of Ukraine?
Yeah, I think it's up to the Ukrainian people. I mean, I don't think that he has any personal ambition to cling on to power. He's democratically elected. He said in the past that he'd be willing to sacrifice his own political position for peace. He's quite right that Ukraine cannot hold elections during a war because of the difficulties of getting votes. I mean, the British didn't hold elections during the First World War and the Second World War, and our democracy endured. So I think for his future I'm less concerned about his individual future, although I think he's been an absolutely inspirational leader for the last 3.5 years. It's really up to Ukrainians to decide his future in a democracy, and for the Ukrainian democracy not to be extinguished by Russia.
Right. Mr. Foreman, I also have to understand from you, how do you think the Russia-Ukraine war will be changing the landscape of defense within the EU, because several nations are now looking to become more and more self-reliant?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 points. I mean, firstly, I think there is recognition that we need to spend more on defence in Europe, and that's what you saw at NATO last month, a commitment to spend 3.5% of GDP on defence and 1.5% on wider security, and that's a reversal of the trend for the last 30 years. So, the strategic genius of Vladimir Putin has not only caused NATO to get bigger because of Finland and Sweden joining and stronger, but also convinced 31 nations to spend more money on their own defences. So that's a good thing, and that's not to be aggressive towards Russia. That's so deterrence is credible, both nuclear and conventional, and also we can defend ourselves. I think the second major impact is recognition that European defence industry is woefully inadequate. It's been run down for 30 years, and we see signs of that reversing now. And signs to become, should we say, slightly more self-reliant. But I think there's still a tension in some countries between buying American and buying European. I don't think that Europe will be able to replace the American defence industries on its own. And I think Europe will always end up buying a mix of European and American kit. I think the third issue, of course, is Ukraine itself. Ukraine has a wealth of knowledge now, especially in some areas like drones. So it shouldn't just be a one-way street for NATO and the European Union spending more money on their own stuff. I think there's opportunities for collaboration with Ukraine to actually bring across lessons that they've learned in fighting the Russians into our own defense industry.
Okay, Mr. Foreman, I have last couple of questions for you. I must also understand from your perspective, do you think Russia was provoked to start this war by simply Ukraine being considered for NATO membership? Is there any credibility to that narrative?
Well, no, I don't think Russia was provoked. I think the excuse of NATO enlargement is a pretext. I think that Russia, or Putin in particular, wishes to bring Ukraine back to under the Russian orbit, back into its sphere of influence. He wants to subjugate it. He wants to destroy its independence and sovereignty. And if you read Putin's long article in 2021, it's not about NATO. It's all about the feeling that Russia lost a limb, shall we say, of Ukraine in 1990. Putin wants to reverse the situation Russia found itself with Ukraine after the Cold War. And I think those are people who say it's all to do with NATO. It's wrong. We didn't hear a peep from Putin when Finland or Sweden joined. And Finland's got a 1,000-kilometer border with Russia.
Okay, interesting. Mr. Foreman, my one last question to you. What becomes the future of NATO then?
Well, I mean, I think actually, again, Putin's given NATO the biggest shot in the arm since 1990. It's given it purpose again. And there was a period, I think, between the 1990s and 2000s. People said, well, why should NATO exist? We've got peace in Europe. It's all about, peacekeeping operations elsewhere, small scale. But actually, Putin's actions over the last decade have made people wake up. I think it's taken too long. I think the summits over the last years, both increasing spending, changing organizations, increasing readiness forces, declaring Russia as the major threat, has really unified NATO in a way it hasn't been for 30 years. And that's been backed up by money. So I think as long as the nations follow through on their commitments, as long as we continue to invest in adequate defences and deterrence, I think there'll be peace on the European continent, which I think is in the interest of everybody.
Absolutely. Mr. John Foreman, thank you so much for joining us on NewsX with that perspective.